Century debate.
Hello. Our programme tonight comes hot on the heels of the final episode of The Disabled Century, a landmark series which charted the experience of disabled people from the First World War onwards. Our discussion tonight will help complete the picture, bring the history of disability up to date and, above all, try and identify the way forward. It happens that the end of the 20th century is marked by a major development affecting the life. That, in essence, is tonight's debate. With me in the studio is a gathering of disabled people, all with experience of discrimination and views on what's good and what's bad about the Act that is known as the DDA. We also have people who appeared in the Disabled Century series. We have people here who work in the field of disability, most notably Margaret Hodge, who's the Minister for Disabled People based at the Department for Education and Employment. Now, many people watching have possibly never heard of the DDA. So for those who haven't, and for those who have, here's a reminder of what it's all about. After a drawn-out battle and 13 private members' bills, disability discrimination legislation finally got onto the statute books in 1995. Currently, its main remit is employment. Cases are dealt with at employment tribunals. By the end of April this year, more than 5,000 claims had been lodged, half of which covered dismissal from work. On average, 250 new complaints come up every month. Employers with less than 15 employees are exempt from the Act. From October this year, the Goods and Services section of the Act comes fully into force. These cases go to the small claims courts. This legislation differs from the Race Relations Act and the Sex Discrimination Act in that the only people who can take cases under it are those who come within its definition of disability. A person has a disability for the purposes of this Act if he has a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on his ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Another difference between the Disability Discrimination Act and the other acts is that it allows for justifiable discrimination. A further important point about how the DDA works is that it basically requires one thing from employers and goods and service providers, and that's what's known as reasonable adjustment. If a disabled person can prove that a reasonable adjustment, which will enable them to work or use a shop or a service, has not been made, then they should win their case. We have with us in the studio someone who has taken a case and got what we believe to be the highest award under the DDA so far. Nick Kirker, how much was the award for?
Well, finally, it was for £167,000.
Rather a large sum. What was it for?
It was for unfair dismissal in a redundancy selection process.
So you took the case and you won it?
Yes.
And was it worth it? Were you pleased with the final outcome?
I was very pleased. I think it was important for disabled people as well in general, but I think everyone should realise that I was fortunate on a number of counts. I was fortunate to have amassed sufficient evidence that contradicted the company's assessment of me. I could show that, you know, the quality of my work didn't match their assessment.
Well, to give us a bit more of an idea of the issues and the kind of cases that have been taken so far, here are some people who have had a go at taking a case under the Act. Denise Greatbanks has a deformed foot and ankle and is embarrassed to wear a skirt.
I was a beautician for a top cosmetic company. I couldn't conform to the corporate image. I can't wear court shoes. Because of my disability, I have to wear trouser suits or smart trousers, and this wasn't, you know, what the beauty image requires. Because I turned up for work one day in a smart trouser suit in this top company's colours, I was sent home like a kindergarten child, humiliated in front of the customers, in full view of all my colleagues, and I knew then that I been treated very unfairly.
Denise decided to take a case under the Act.
I settled out of court just for the salary that I should have earned for the 12 months while this case was, proceeding. My advice to anybody would be to see a case through to the end, and I wish I'd have had the strength to do so.
After many phone calls, Damon Rose found a landlord with a vacancy, but the landlord didn't think it would be suitable for a blind person. The bathroom, he said, would be too small.
I hasten to add, he said it was nothing to do with the dog, it was to do with the fact that I was blind. And that was it, really. He was quite offensive. He wanted to know whether my girlfriend, who I'd mentioned, he wanted to know whether she was an invalid too. He said that the insurance didn't cover people like me. I did offer to check it out for him, but he wouldn't give me any details of his insurance company. And I did explain to him about the Disability Discrimination Act and that this was against the law, and he said thank you ever so much for telling him, but didn't seem very interested.
It seemed like an open and shut case.
It took a whole year to actually get into the courtroom, and I lost spectacularly. His defence was that he believed the steps leading into this flat were too dangerous for a blind person to climb. You can only get out of a DDA case on a health and safety aspect. Of course, blind people can walk up and down steps. I'd never even thought of steps as a problem for me before, but bizarrely, he won.
Sandra Stanton is a solicitor. She was cross-examined for 4.5 days about her disability, clinical depression.
I found the questioning extremely intrusive and very hard to deal with. My work had always been an important and integral part of my life. I'm quite sure that the process of going through this case has been instrumental in extending the period of my depression, or at least delaying the rate of recovery.
Sandra settled out of court, so what's her advice to other people with mental illness who want to take a case under the Act?
If they feel strong enough, then they have as much right to fight for their employment and the security of their employment as any other disabled person.
A couple of years ago, when I was still unemployed, after becoming blind some years earlier, I applied for what was my first attempt at a proper job with a local organisation, a local charity actually, and I was told that I wouldn't be able to apply simply because I didn't have a full driving licence. Now obviously if you're registered blind, you don't expect to be driving. The job, from what I knew, actually didn't require driving. All that it required was that somebody was mobile, and obviously I use public transport and other ways of getting around. I was simply, however, told that I would not be considered, and therefore I took a case under the Disability Discrimination Act.
With only 14 employees, the charity was exempt from the Act.
I attempted, with the help of another organisation, to bring a case, and we did actually get to an industrial tribunal, but we could not get past that exclusion. It's these small organisations, in, for example, the voluntary sector, that people like myself often look to get their first foothold back in the job market. If we encounter blatant prejudice there, what chance for us is there really to get back into the world of work?
A number of issues raised there that indicate some of the problems with the Act. Let's kick off with quite a specific point which seems to be causing concern. The issue of establishing who is and who isn't disabled. Now, Caroline Gooding, you're a solicitor. You've worked quite extensively with the DDA already. What's the problem with this definition?
Well, basically, the definition requires the disabled person, the person taking the case, to prove the point that they are disabled. And to do that, they have to prove that they have a long-term condition which has a substantial adverse effect on their day-to-day activities. So they have to emphasise all the negative things about the effects of their condition. And you can see the effect that had on somebody like Sandra Stanton, where she had to emphasise repeatedly all the things that she was unable to do. And the normal day-to-day activities are defined in the Act, and they're defined restrictively, so that, for example, they don't really take into account the kind of difficulties that people with mental health problems, people with learning disabilities face.
Julian Howes, you represent a group whose members are not included under this Act, but you would like to see them included. Do you think that people with asymptomatic HIV are disabled?
I think that as somebody living with HIV for 9 years, I can say that people with asymptomatic HIV at the moment are discriminated against merely because they have the virus. Look at the States, for example, which has gone down another route towards legislation where, in effect, merely the association and perception that somebody has AIDS or is HIV positive gives you protection against discrimination. So if your colleagues refuse to sit next to you in a canteen, that is a cause that you have rise to action for. If we want people who have AIDS and HIV to come out and to accept treatment and to be proud about the fact that they have this virus, a horrible virus as it is, but want to live with it rather than die with it, then I think equality and anti-discrimination should be the plank of this. I think the government has fudged it and missed a big, big chance.
O.J. Willow, do you think you should be included under the Act?
Certainly. I've suffered from clinical depression and borderline personality disorder, and it's impaired my life quite considerably. There are days when I cannot get out of bed. There are days when I cannot function under any level. But if I go for a job on my insurance forms, for example, I have to declare that I have a mental health history. It goes back to what you were saying about variable illness. On some days, like I've said, getting out of bed is a major problem. On other days, I can do things like this. I can be out talking to people. I can be using my skills. But the Act itself discriminates against me from doing that. Because if I do that, then I'm not disabled because I'm not displaying the symptoms often enough.
Now, James Partridge, you campaigned to have people with facial disfigurements included under the Act. Did you have any success?
Yes, we did. And this is the interesting thing. One of the only exceptions to this definition is around severe disfigurement. People are treated as if they had a disability. And this is the only area, I think, in the Act as it stands at the moment, where perception of disability, in other words, the public's perception or an employer's perception, can count in putting a case. Unfortunately, I think the use of the word severe disfigurement is probably inappropriate, but at least there was an acceptance when this bill was drafted that that perception, as in the Americans with Disabilities Act, that was a relevant condition that would bring about potentially discrimination.
Margaret Hodge, let me ask you, we heard from Julian Howes, we heard from O.J. Willow, we heard from James Partridge. There seems to be some confusion. It's sort of not black and white, it's quite grey. Should certain people be included under the Act who currently are not?
Well, let me first say that this was an Act that we inherited from the last government, and in fact we've established a Disability Rights Task Force, of which Caroline is one member, at which we are looking at the issue of who is and who is not covered in the current definition, and that's a key issue that we're having to address. And I think a lot of the examples that you raised in your films are very much the ones that we are focusing on. But why have we gone ahead and implemented an Act that was passed that was flawed, but that was passed by the previous government? But because, for two reasons. I do think it brings important advances to people with disabilities, and we want to see those brought in as quickly as we can. And you suggested that it was all implemented. It isn't yet. The access to goods and services, the issues that were raised about access to shops or access to banks, they are not yet covered by it. And the second thing to say is, even under the current definition, about 10 million people are covered by that definition. That's a lot of people with disabilities who've experienced massive discrimination for many, many years. And we want to ensure that they are assisted through legislation. Can I make one final point, which is important? I think one of the greatest problems and flaws of the Act was that there wasn't a Disability Rights Commission that can support individuals in taking action where they feel they're discriminated against. That we're putting right as we speak.
Some of the points you've mentioned we will be coming back to in a moment, but David Roubain, it is clear that the definition, I mean, you're a solicitor, it seems that because the definition of disability is still unclear, it may be sorted out, who knows, that some people must be deterred by taking a case because they're not quite sure whether they are disabled or not.
Oh, I think that's certainly the case. There are, for example, just to explore the analogy further, the Act requires that somebody has an impairment that lasts for at least 12 months. Now, in many instances, that's very clear. Somebody whose impairment is permanent is certainly falls within the provisions of the Act. But let's take the example of somebody who has a nasty accident and breaks their leg. Well, if the effect of the impairment lasts for 364 days, they are not disabled. If it's 365 days, they are disabled. Inevitably, with this kind of paring down definition of disability, you're going to have people who fall within a grey area. Not only are the employers and service providers not going to know whether they're disabled, they are not even going to know whether they're disabled.
How does one define disability? Any suggestions?
Yes, disability is the interaction between a person with an impairment and the negative impacts of society or the environment or whatever, including attitudes. It's the interaction between those two. That is what disability is. It is not something that we own, it's something that's put upon us. But I really do think we have to recognise that none of the other non-discrimination legislation require people to prove who they are.
So that's one difficulty, defining what is a disability at the moment. Now, Graham Carson, people who come to you, what do they expect from the DDA?
I think they expect it to be a comprehensive civil rights piece of legislation, and it isn't. Many areas aren't actually covered. For example, education isn't covered. We recently had a case where a disabled student had the right qualifications for a particular course, but because some of the buildings on campus weren't accessible, was denied entry to a university. That is not proper sort of comprehensive civil rights legislation when education is excluded.
Douglas Silas, people come to you. What do they expect they can get from the Act and what support from the Act?
Well, they're hoping that they're going to be able to action a case where they're going to be able to either prevent discrimination or show that they have been discriminated against and get compensation for that. Or, you know, obviously there are situations when they also in employment, for example, want to hold on to the job which they're being told that they can't keep anymore because their disability or their perception is that their disability will prevent them from getting that. But there are many different hurdles that they have to go through. We've been talking about the fact that they've got to prove that they are disabled within the meaning of the Act. But there are all other issues, including financial ones, which we were talking about in the Circa case before. You've got to get to the level when you can bring the case, and you've got to get to that tribunal for that tribunal to award you what you want.
Another problem on the question of employment is that the original Act excluded all firms that had fewer than 20 employees. That has now been reduced to 15. Now, James Strachan, you wanted to see it reduced even further, didn't you?
We did, and I think many of the disability charities and, in fact, some employers' organisations wanted that for the simple reason that it is impossible to justify why, in the case of racial discrimination, there were no exemptions. All employers fall within the law. The same with discrimination in respect of gender, but not with disability. The poor cousin, if you like, of discrimination legislation.
Jim Redman, representing private businesses, would they like to see the number reduced?
Yes, I don't think there's any real problem. I think the main criteria for any small business in taking on an employee is that they should be able to do the job. And that is irrespective of race or disability or anything else. If they can do the job and if they can fit in satisfactorily with a small workforce, then that's what the small business wants.
But would private businesses be happy to have the responsibility under the law to consider employing someone who is disabled?
Yes, I mean, as long as you don't start putting in quota systems or anything else. I mean, that would be totally impossible to achieve. And I think also you have to understand that in small businesses, when you're looking at recruitment, at least 50% of recruitment comes from people that the business themselves know. They're from relatives or from friends of employees and so on. So they don't very often go through the formal process of recruitment.
Margaret Hodge, what about on this issue, the number of employees a firm must have before it's exempt or not exempt from the DDA? Is that being looked at? Why not reduce it even further?
Well, I share James's view that it's unjust that a firm of any size you know, just because a firm employs a smaller number of people, they should be exempt from disability discrimination legislation. The issue really is how we get there. And again, the legacy we inherited was that when we came in, there was a threshold of 20 people in businesses, and we wanted to start reducing that. And the reality is that a lot of the representative organisations of businesses, the CBI and the Federation of Small Businesses and others, didn't feel confidence in going directly from a 20 down to 0.
Right, let's turn our attention to part 3 of the DDA, which we mentioned earlier. It deals with goods and services, and it comes into effect next October. Let's get a flavour of what one wheelchair user is up against. Kay Trujillo took us for a tour of her local shops. The pub was the first port of call.
This is my local pub, and for years I've been trying to get the step removed so we can have a ramp there to make it easier to get in and out of the pub without any help. So now I'm going to call the landlord out to come and see if he's heard of the Discrimination Act. Hello, Martin.
Okay. All right, love.
Have you heard of the Discrimination Act?
No, well, just a little bit, that's all.
So I was wondering, does that mean we might be able to get a ramp put down outside this pub so we can get in without any help?
I think there's a problem with planning. We have to get planning for it. And also we have to provide proper toilets if we put a ramp up.
There is another watering hole a bit further on.
I'd love to go in that pub. It's a lovely pub. But can I do so? Because the car's there and they keep that locked. So you have to call the proprietor by phone before you go in.
At the shops, steps loom large.
Step, can I get up the step? And you have to knock on the window. The service.
A hairdo doesn't pose a challenge.
Can I make an appointment, please? This is another shop where I have to call for help. I knock on the window and I call for the butcher to come out.
Hello.
Hello. Have you heard of the Discrimination Act?
Yes, I've heard of it, yes.
Do you know in October there's going to be a new part of the new bill come out, service and goods?
I know there's something, yes.
And
yes.
that would involve doing something about your step. Here's another shop here that when I went in on last week, the lady there said not to come in again without knocking on the window, as I might break the glass door, which of course I wouldn't even dream of doing that. But she was very adamant not to come in without knocking on the window.
I mean, normally when she comes in, there's always someone at the counter, and they always open the door for her, you know, and she hasn't had any problems before. And the only time that something like that would occur is obviously if we were busy inside, you know, when she'd have to knock on the glass and catch our attention. We don't have the resources of like the bigger companies, and so anything we do would have to be on a small scale. You know, we couldn't completely revamp the whole shop because it's just economically it's not feasible.
Well, I know the shop has a ramp, so I'll call the proprietor out. Excuse me? Could I have some help, please? Where's your ramp that you used to have?
Well, I'm afraid it's got damaged. It got damaged one evening about 2 weeks ago.
Oh dear.
Some of the local lads
Do you know when it's going to be repaired?
Well, I'm promised that they'll have it repaired in 2 weeks.
Well, that's a bit of a shame then.
At last, Kay found a ramp, but it wasn't made for humans. It was made for pianos. Now, that was obviously a wheelchair-centric view, but what are the issues for people with other sorts of disability? Colin Lowe, what are you and other people in your position hoping to get from Part 3, goods and services?
Well, one of the greatest improvements that visually impaired people like myself would like to see is greater access to information. I mean, we're increasingly in this information age being bombarded with information, and it's mostly inaccessible for visually impaired people. Somebody who needs large print or the document put into Braille or on tape. Most of the time, the information doesn't come in
in that form. There have been improvements. There's a lot more stuff available, you know, from government departments, service providers, what have you, in Braille, on tape, in large print now. And you can go to the theatre and have an audio a description of the performance. And there's even the prospect of some audio description on television. So things are looking up.
Phil Friend, do you think Part 3 is a big step forward?
I think what it's doing is it's focusing some businesses' minds on issues which hitherto have been ignored. I think Colin's point about information, for example, many of the larger organisations are clearly beginning to look at how they can develop information for people who can't see normal print and so on. But I think there's a huge number of companies who are either ignorant of the Act or I think the film showed a small shopkeeper who clearly would not do anything major. And in local communities, that's a major issue. I think what's changed is that disabled people now have much greater expectations. I have 4 children. I want to go to the cinema with them, go on holiday with them, travel in my town with them, and that's not too much to ask, I think. And it's in the small areas that the barriers are. Marks and Spencers don't have a problem with this.
Nobody is asking any business to do something unreasonable, and nobody is asking any business to suffer undue hardship. But what we are asking is that as a society, it is recognised that we are left out. We are non-citizens. And until we get some discrimination legislation, and it has to be real comprehensive discrimination legislation, that underwrites and emphasises the government's commitment to our rights, we're not going to get anywhere.
Labour's pre-election manifesto was very big on civil rights. Are you still sticking to that?
Well, I'm very proud of our record in office in the first 2 years of office. What we have done is we are going ahead with implementing Part 3 of the DDA because we think it does bring important progress in terms of access to goods and services.
Civil rights.
Well, hang on a minute. Civil rights, civil rights, Fred, are about how people experience their day-to-day lives. That's what this is about. It's not a theoretical argument. We are bringing in a Disability Rights Commission. We're doing a huge amount around trying to open opportunities for work for disabled people with the New Deal for Disabled People. But one final point, I know I'm hogging it a bit, one final point. Legislation is only part of the answer, and I shall keep saying that. If legislation were the total answer to dealing with the massive discrimination, we'd have done it years ago and been effective.
Initially, we didn't have a commission to go with the DDA. There is a commission coming in, as you mentioned. Now, does that mean, David Roubain, that we therefore have to stick with the DDA rather than completely redrafting it?
I doubt it, and the reason for that is that there are massive changes that would be required to incorporate full and comprehensive civil rights. A number of the points have been raised. Education issues around transport, extending anti-discrimination provisions to cover all services. I don't have a completely closed mind as to how that should be, and you know, I wait to see what the proposals are. But so long as whatever is proposed deals with all of the undealt with provision, that's the most important thing. But one other thing I'd like to say. My own view is that we mustn't escape the fact that discrimination is systemic. It is not simply about a few people behaving badly. We are all a product of an environment which taught us that disabled people are second, third, fourth-class citizens. And we need to deal with discrimination at that level. It has to be dealt with at that level if it's going to be effective.
Pickering, you wanted to come in just now.
Yes, Fred, thank you. I feel that education isn't within the Discrimination Act, and I think that's a major failing. I think that has to happen before, as a nation, we can move forward.
Fred, can I come in? Because I don't want your viewers to get... I mean, education is not in the disability discrimination legislation. It's an issue that the task force is looking at. But the government is making enormous strides to ensure that there's a more inclusive offer for those children where, you know, they and their parents want it, and it's appropriate for the child. But, you know, we're getting there and we're moving towards that objective.
But are you prepared to put education within the DDA?
Well, I'm not, you know, I think this is an issue of key importance.
Worth considering.
I think it's terribly important. And in our discussions in the Disability Rights Task Force, I'm not going to preempt it, I was going to say, I think this is one of the key issues on which we need to act. And where I do agree is if we can actually get it right with the kids, you can tackle a lot of the attitudes and culture which you call systemic, others might call institutional.
Caroline Gooding.
My big concern is that in goods and services, some people are doing things. They're preempting the legal requirements, and that's great, the big businesses who see that it makes sense. But other people, they'll be sitting back and waiting to see actually what the law means. And my big fear is that it's going to turn out to be the emperor's new clothes as far as goods and services is concerned, meaning that actually the law has very little teeth. I'm very much afraid that Damon Rose's experience is going to be replicated, and that service providers are going to find it just too easy to justify treating somebody in a discriminatory fashion, what I would call discriminatory, because what the Act says is, if in the service provider's opinion, there is a justification that's listed in the Act, and it's reasonable for them to hold. And in Damon's case, the judge kind of agreed with the landlord that it was a reasonable opinion to hold, because judges don't know much better than landlords when it comes down to disability. And my big fear is in terms of the goods and services side, that when the law actually gets tested in the courts, we'll find that it just doesn't provide the framework that we need.
Well, the answer is we don't really know. And, you know, Caroline may be right. And I think the other thing to say is, you know, the actual physical adjustments to the buildings won't take place until, you know, they're going to start in 2004, when Damon's case that's the point at which actually it may kick in to affect the access to the hotel. We don't know, and that's another reason why we may constantly be having to review our legislation as we get experience of what it actually means in practice. There isn't one big bang bit of legislation which is going to resolve all the issues of discrimination that disabled people face. It will have to be a continuous process.
But the fact that we're waiting until 2004 is institutional disablism itself. Because why? We're waiting because the institutions that make up our government and make up our society say, we don't want to do that, so you can't do it until we want to do it, and then you'll do it. And I'm sorry, but that is one facet of the institutional disablism that we as individuals and as a group as a whole face every day.
We've got the Disability Discrimination Act, and it's going to change, it's going to be adjusted, as Margaret has said, as time goes on. But I do think that there are positive things that we can build on from that. And I think that disabled people have a large part to play in this. I mean, whether you're talking about work with hospitals, with churches, I think when disabled people themselves draw attention to the barriers they face, very often the goodwill is there, and people just don't realise. I mean, simple things like being able to get petrol at a petrol station. I've said how difficult that is, and people say, oh, I never thought of that, you know, and yet it's a major thing for me. I have to go to one petrol station, you know, to get that. If we can explain this more, even in our own local area, go to the small shops and explain that there is legislation there, people sort of sit up and listen much more than they did before.
There are positive... Rachel Hurst, you were trying to come in.
You have to explain to live. I mean, I understand what Nancy's saying, and I agree that we can, as individuals, do an awful lot to change people's attitudes. But I'm awfully sorry, I get awfully bored with the fact that every day I get out of bed, I go out into the public, and I have to spend my entire time changing attitudes. It's exhausting.
I think one of the things we must check up with education is, in the 1970s, education, people was put into mainstream schools without the proper support. I was put into mainstream schools without the proper support, what damaged me quite a lot. Being forced to do sport with being the only disabled person there, as a disabled person with lots of able-bodied kids, really put my confidence back. And looking at an adult, when I was dating a disabled person, going to a disco and being told you can't go into this disco without an able-bodied carer, and then looking around and saying, this is a date. Do you know what a date is? You don't bring a third person on a date. And then being told, well, we may let you get in as a favour. No, I pay the same price to get into that disco as everybody else. I pay the same price for drinks as everybody else. I expect to be treated as everybody else. And as a person with a physical disability, as a learning difficulty, with a mental health problem, I'm like, nobody wants me because I'm too complicated. It's too much for even charities, you know, to work with. So what do? And I'm meant to sit at home? I'm not old enough for that. I don't think anybody is.
Yes, it was interesting to hear what he said about getting into the disco. I have problems in getting into hotels and restaurants. I'm hearing impaired. I don't look as I'm disabled. And when I turn up with my hearing dog, people think it's a farce. And I have been refused entry into restaurants and hotels. And on one occasion, I was so incensed because the manager wouldn't come and speak to me. They sent a minion to tell me that I wasn't welcome. So I decided to call the police and asked the police if they would come round to speak to the manager and I wanted to have a lunch. And they said, oh, no, it's up to the restaurant owner. If he doesn't want you in, there's nothing we can do about it.
Just a final comment. Are we, in a few years' time, still going to have the DDA, or are we going to have a completely new animal? Colin Lowe, what do you think? Are we going to stick with what we've got?
I don't know the answer to that. The task force, as we've heard, is working on it, and I'm sure it'll come up with proposals for changes to the legislation. I'm pretty sure they won't all be incorporated within one all-singing, all-dancing piece of civil rights legislation. I think that some of them we may find introduced through education legislation or electoral law or legislation on transport.
Rachel Hurst, a final comment from you?
I want in 20 years to know that society recognises disablism and tries to do something about it.
And the DDA, in your opinion, is not good enough?
No, it's absolutely useless. What we need is a comprehensive legislation. I'm not sure whether it's done in one with lots, but they've all got to come in on the same day and they've got to be implemented within a decent time frame, not the 2040 lark that we're getting.
Well, we haven't solved all the problems, but we are going to have to leave it there. I think we have had a genuinely constructive and informative debate. It's clear we're not going to get complete agreement, but it's probably fair to say that the 21st century will treat disabled people better than this one. Whether that has anything to do with the Disability Discrimination Act, we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks to everyone for taking part in this debate. Thank you all for watching. From all of us here, good night